Dave Emery, and this is side one of For the Record program number 428, Gold Warriors, an interview with Peggy Seagrave. This interview is going to deal with a newly published book called Gold Warriors, subtitled America's Secret Recovery of Yamashita's Gold. This was just published in hardcover by Verso, and it was authored by Sterling Seagrave and Peggy Seagrave. Sterling has a case of bronchitis, so it is going to be our pleasure to visit with his wife and co-author, Peggy Seagrave, and this is being recorded on October 6th of the year 2003. Before we get to the interview, let me remind you that on the Spitfire website in the For the Record section at spitfirelist.com, there will be a detailed description of this interview available within a week or so of the airing of this broadcast. Sister station WFMU-FM is archiving the For the Record programs on Real Audio. More recent programs are streaming at WFMU.org/Dave Emery. Older programs available at a longer URL linked to both that address and to the For the Record section of the Spitfire website. It is my pleasure to introduce Peggy Seagrave. Peggy, welcome to our airwaves.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm happy to be here.
As Iris Chang, the author of a book on the rape of Nanking, commented on the jacket quite appropriately, Sterling and yourself have uncovered one of the biggest secrets of the 20th century, and that is the focal point of our interview. Peggy, let's begin with the subject of the Japanese looting of Asia in the decades leading up to and including the Second World War, culminating in Operation Golden Lily.
Well, Dave, soldiers killing each other, that's really only half the story of war. The other half is the financial side. The most important thing about war isn't how much you conquer, but how much money, gold, platinum, diamonds, books, paintings, and cultural treasures you can steal. There's nothing new about war looting, but during World War II, Japan was much more methodical than the Nazis or the Soviets. While its soldiers were committing atrocities, the Yakuza underworld, the giant Japanese corporations, secret societies like Black Dragon and Black Ocean, and imperial princes closely related to Emperor Hirohito stole billions. Their secret organization called Ken no Yuri, or Golden Lily, was bossed by Hirohito's brother, Prince Chichibu. The man who hid a lot of the loot in the Philippines was Hirohito's cousin, Prince Takeda, and it's all named after the famous Japanese general Yamashita. Hence, this treasure has become known as Yamashita's gold. On this question of the interlinking of the giant Japanese corporations called the Zaibatsu, the underworld, the Yakuza, the patriotic societies, and the imperial family, it's very important to realize that in Japan, the overworld of the leadership is in fact married to the underworld. It's a long-standing relationship.
Just 1 second, Peggy. Let me just fill in a couple of these names and spell them for the audience. Zaibatsu is Z-A-I-B-A-T-S-U.
Correct.
The Yakuza is Y-A-K-U-Z-A.
Correct.
And another of the elements in this imbroglio are the patriotic societies, something that I've discussed in past broadcasts, particularly the Black Ocean,
right,
and Black Dragon societies. And Peggy, I'm going to ask you to fill in details about all of these elements, and also Princes Chichibu and Takeda. They are part of the royal family, along with Emperor Hirohito and General Yamashita in the Philippines. And those are the elements for the members of the listening audience. And Peggy, describe how these elements work together in the looting of Asia and culminating in Golden Lily.
Okay. You cannot separate in Japan the giant corporations from the underworld, from the patriotic societies, or the imperial family. These groups are interlinked financially, and it is a long-standing relationship and a supportive relationship. In Manchuria, in the 1930s, the Zaibatsu worked with corrupt warlords and Chinese gangsters to transform Manchuria into a huge poppy field. By 1937, the Japanese Zaibatsu and the Japanese Army and their gangster associates were responsible for 90% of the world's illicit narcotics. This was bringing in $3 billion a year, and you can be sure that Hirohito got his customary cut of the profits.
And the Zaibatsu, the corporations, how do they figure into this synthesis?
The Zaibatsu were, if you can think of General Motors or another such corporation, they were huge vertical corporations that had factories, their own banks, and their own financial support structure. They were given, one could say, monopoly rights to develop different colonial properties, such as in Manchuria, the mining enterprises, to run factories in China once China was conquered. They had rights over rubber in Indonesia and over oil in Indonesia. In each case, the Zaibatsu sort of divided up the colonial economic spectrum.
And some of these names, by the way, are names that will be familiar to people. Some of the names of the Zaibatsu will be familiar to people due to the fact that they have now become major international corporate players. Companies like Mitsubishi, banks like Sumitomo, Mitsui, and others. These are the Zaibatsu. There obviously are more than just the ones I've named. But these are not unfamiliar names to people who are conversant with some of the major players in international corporate life.
Not at all, and of course don't forget Nissan. And all of these Zaibatsu were theoretically broken up at the end of the war during the occupation, but in fact this did not happen. There was a paper chase, a paper reorganization, but these organizations have in fact regrouped and have not been significantly altered in their configuration since they were established in the 1930s and before.
Before we get to the subject of what actually took place in Japan during the occupation after World War II, I'm going to take the liberty of reading a short section from the introduction from the first chapter to your book, and one of the things that I'd like you to flesh out for us before we get to the topic of the occupation is the patriotic and ultranationalist societies, because these aren't well known to an American audience, and we don't have anything exactly corresponding to this in the United States. Your book begins in the late 19th century, chapter 1, with Behind the Mask.
Right.
I'm going to read a paragraph here, and if I could ask you then to develop the subject of the patriotic societies and how they fit into this infernal synthesis that we're dealing with here.
Okay.
During the night of October 7th, 1895, 30 Japanese assassins forced their way into Korea's royal palace in Seoul. Bursting into the Queen's private quarters, they cut down 2 ladies-in-waiting and cornered Queen Min. When the minister of the royal household tried to shield her, a swordsman slashed off both his hands. The defenseless queen was stabbed and slashed repeatedly and carried wailing out to the palace garden, where she was thrown onto a pile of firewood drenched with kerosene and set aflame. An American military advisor, General William Dye, was one of several foreigners who heard and saw the killers milling around in the palace compound with drawn swords while the queen was burned alive. Japan declared that the murders were committed by, quote, Koreans dressed as Japanese in European clothes, unquote, a gloss greeted with ridicule by the diplomatic community. According to the British minister in Tokyo, Sir Ernest Satow, First Secretary Sugimura of the Japanese legation in Korea led the assassins. And then you and Sterling go on to develop that the Japanese government and the patriotic societies collaborated in this particularly grisly assassination, which was part of the looting process that we're talking about here. Tell us about Black Ocean and Black Dragon.
Well, I think it's very useful to think of these groups as paramilitaries. Before Japan was willing to commit itself officially, they used these groups just as private military groups are being used today around the world by the United States and other governments. Under the guise of ultranationalism that one could liken to the Nazi Party, to the Mussolini's supporters, they served the same function.
And basically, they were covert operators and precursors of the more formal military forces.
Exactly.
And again, the Yakuza and the Zaibatsu and the Patriotic Societies all collaborated in what was a very systematic imperialist policy, and in one in which the formal dividing lines between the overworld and the underworld were basically not applicable. This was a criminal enterprise, but sort of a top-to-bottom operation.
Right, but one of the good things from the point of view of covert operations was deniability of the patriotic societies.
And these elements, so obviously that they could deny, as was indicated in that passage. Basically, it wasn't them, or even if the cover-up unraveled, the initial disclaimer was that it wasn't Japanese at all. But if the cover-up unraveled, then it could simply be pinned on these criminals and not on anybody that was connected with the power elite in a formal sense.
Right, exactly. It gave the government formal deniability.
Peggy, in the wake of the Iraq War, there's been much discussion in the American media of how ideally the occupation of Iraq would be a success if it were to be conducted like the occupation of Japan after World War II. Yet in Gold Warriors, you and Sterling present a very different picture of the, quote, success, unquote, of that occupation. I wonder if you would develop that topic for us, if you would, in particular, the machinations of Douglas MacArthur and his staff members, such as Bonner Fellers and Charles Willoughby, and a number of people who not only figured in the Japanese imperial conquest of Asia prior to enduring World War II, particularly during the war, but people who figured in a big way in the post-war history of Japan, such as the Messrs. Kishi, Kodama, Sasakawa, and Tanaka, and the other figures who we'll be dealing with later in the interview.
Okay, well, that's a mouthful, but let's go. The U.S. occupation of Japan was only a success because MacArthur and his team, including Bonner Fellers, decided that the only way to neutralize communism in Asia was to put the same fascists who bombed Pearl Harbor back into power. So the GIs who died on the beaches actually died for nothing. MacArthur teamed up with the biggest gangsters, with the biggest members of the Zaibatsu, and with the imperial family to set up the Liberal Democratic Party, paying for it with the treasure stolen from Asia. So this is the same party that is still running Japan today. And the idea that the American occupation of Japan resulted in a showcase democracy is a fallacy, because what you have in Japan today is a one-party dictatorship that has existed since 1950. The reason so many people are making this comparison to Iraq is that they completely misunderstand the nature of the U.S. occupation of Japan. MacArthur ruled Japan with complete autonomy. There was no freedom of the press. Any journalist who disagreed with MacArthur's point of view was sent packing. And it's only been in the last decade that scholars have begun to challenge the post-war propaganda about the Japanese occupation, that we are beginning to understand what really went on. In this respect, the work by Dr. Chalmers Johnson and Dr. Michael Schaller are very important. In terms of MacArthur's allegiances, the power blocks that he set up in Japan, Among them was the gangster Kodama, another gangster named Sasakawa, and a political operator named Kishi, who had spent part of the war running the world's largest heroin cartel out of Manchuria. Kishi spent the other part of the war running American POWs as slave labor.
By the way, let me interrupt briefly, Peggy. Messrs. Kodama and Sasakawa are known to the veteran listeners to this program, both in addition to their machinations in Imperial Japan and post-war Japan, also very active with the Unification Church at Sun Myung Moon.
Right.
And we've talked about that in a number of programs, including, for the record, 291, from Kennebunkport to Pearl Harbor, Bush, Moon, and the Rising Sun. Tell us about Mr. Kishi.
Kishi Nobusuke ended up working in Manchuria with Tojo at the time, and with several other men became key, as I've said, in the Army's heroin production. He thereafter became the Minister of Munitions Defense, and as such was responsible for slave labor operations in Manchuria and elsewhere. He subsequently became Prime Minister of Japan.
And one of the key players who worked, and again, all of these people were inextricably linked with the Japanese looting and with the war effort, and then continued to be prime movers in the Japanese political and economic scene in the post-war period. Mr. Tanaka, someone who will figure in the subsequent discussion and later in the interview. Tell us about him.
Oh, boy. Okay. Well, Mr. Tanaka, who also became Prime Minister, worked he had a number of munitions contracts, and at the end of the war was able, through sleight of hand, to move some $73 million worth of money out of Japan to pay for phony munitions contracts. Thereafter, he became a protege of Prime Minister Kishi, and eventually worked his way up to Prime Minister himself.
And we're going to talk about him in connection with the M Fund in a minute. I just want to stress for listeners that Messrs. Kishi and Kodama and Sasakawa were war criminals.
Yes, they were all in Sugamo prison.
And I guess that's sort of a classic example of the old adage that iron bars do not a prison make. I guess particularly when the bars are actually made out of golden lily bullion.
Well, the point is that as early as the end of 1945, MacArthur and the State Department were already getting ready to stop not only war crimes investigations, but war crime trials. And this was, by 1948, the whole thing had come to a close. And that's the year that these men were liberated from Sugamo.
And then became primary movers, prime players on the Japanese political stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And they never faced trial.
And they also had a lot to do with what was going on in this country as well. Now, we've spoken about Golden Lily. One of the principal players in the events that is described in Gold Warriors is a very important, though at least to the general public, little-known man with many names, a Mr. Santa Romana. Tell us about Santi, as he was nicknamed, who he was, and his successful recovery of loot that was stashed in the Philippines under Golden Lily.
Well, according to CIA sources, including former Deputy Director Ray Klein, Santa Romana was a Filipino born in 1907. During the war, he remained in the islands, and he became one of MacArthur's most effective agents. In a complex game after the war, Santa Romana was given dozens of identities and became the gatekeeper for the covert slush funds that were set up with the treasures recovered from the Philippines. Memos we have written by Santa Romana show that he was familiar with gold swaps and money laundering operations carried out in the post-war years in the Bahamas, among other places. In his two different wills, he described that he had used various aliases, that he held vast sums of cash and treasures in banks around the world. And in a second will written on his deathbed, he listed personal assets in excess of $500 million. Santa Romana recorded in another handwritten memo how the CIA went about setting up proprietary companies as shields for carrying out various mercenary operations, and that of these, he noted that conflict of interest and ethics of transactions do not apply to the CIA. He wrote that the CIA and the Nixon administration were convinced that Asia as a whole was a mess because of the communist threat, and that the administration was strongly advocating open American intervention in the internal affairs of the Third World Asian cartel members.
And Santa Romana actually became aware of the huge gold deposits. By the way, we should perhaps stress that with regard to Golden Lily, which was the looting of Asia, much of that loot was brought back to Japan, but when the American submarine blockade became effective in early 43, Princess Chichibu and Takeda were then instrumental in stashing a lot of this loot in the Philippines during World War II. So in addition to the loot that was brought back to Japan, a lot of the loot was stashed in the Philippines because the Japanese hoped to gain stewardship over the Philippines through a peace.
Exactly.
If you would tell us, how did Santa Romana and a man that figures prominently in this account, General Lansdale, how did they learn about Golden Lily, and if you could tell us about the recovery of that loot in the Philippines?
Well, during the war, I think as early as 1943, America knew that the Japanese were hiding treasure in caves and tunnels in the Philippines because there were a number of secret agents who were still in the area and reporting back to Australia, which is where MacArthur was headquartered during this period of time. When Japan surrendered, General Yamashita was taken prisoner in the Philippines, but it was unseemly to torture a general because this would have been rather obvious to his American defense attorneys. Instead, the decision was made to torture his driver, who was forced to tell Lansdale and Santa Romana and others where he had driven Yamashita during the last 10 months of the war. The driver took Santa Romana and Lansdale, who was then working with the OSS CIA, to 12 secret treasure vaults. Once this treasure was recovered, President Truman made the decision to keep this a secret. Lansdale was a right-wing fanatic, so he tipped off a bunch of Wall Street big shots, including former President Hoover, and they all decided to set up a secret slush fund called the Black Eagle Trust.
Among the things that you write about is the fact that we're going to be getting into Black Eagle Trust in a big way in the next side, but some of this gold actually found its way into accounts in the name of Douglas MacArthur and Herbert Hoover.
Okay, you've asked a question that I can't answer right now. I have to ask Sterling about that. That was written in the Yamato dynasty.
Correct.
And we have dealt subsequently with the issues of Hoover and MacArthur, I think, in a better way in Gold Warriors.
Okay. Briefly, Peggy, let's talk about Black Eagle, a subject that I want to get into in more detail in the second part of the interview since we're running low on time. But the Santa Romana's recovered gold in the Philippines was blended into something called the Black Eagle Trust. Could you just give us a brief overview? We've got 3 minutes left. What was Black Eagle and what was it used for? We're going to get into this and some of the people in more detail on the other side.
Okay. The Black Eagle Trust is named after the Black Eagle that was impressed on Nazi gold ingots that were recovered in Europe at the end of World War II. Interestingly enough, only a single bar of Nazi gold was conserved by the Allies as an artifact, and all the rest of it was melted down, thus disguising any chemical fingerprints that might have led to restitution to the legal owners. But most of the Black Eagle assets consist of Japanese war loot recovered by Santa Romana and Lansdale in the Philippines and by MacArthur in Japan.
And this ultimately was put to a number of different uses in the post-war world.
Yes. Well, it was. This was the basis for covert action and manipulation of elections and of politicians around the world.
One of the points, too, that you and Sterling make in Gold Warriors is that the amount of gold that was looted from occupied Asia was so vast, and among the things apparently motivating President Truman and others to keep this secret, in addition to obviously the communist threat that was building and the desire to fight that when use the funds to do that, was that the gold stash was so huge that it actually threatened the international currency system because it could have undermined currencies. Could you just briefly cover that for us, and then we're going to take a break and we'll continue this discussion on the other side.
Okay. Well, at this point, at the end of World War II, there was the Bretton Woods Convention, and this established or continued, if I can put it that way, to keep the gold standard, but it was a gold standard to be based on the U.S. dollar. Essentially, by making the U.S. dollar the currency of conversion from gold, you had a monopoly. Basically, the dollar became the post-war standard for other currencies, but because it was pegged to $35, the price of gold was pegged to $35 an ounce. If the amount of gold that suddenly turned out to be liquid and available were much greater, if the supply was much greater, this could have undermined the dollar and, in turn, the rest of the international currency. Of course, you're exactly right.
Okay, we have been visiting with Peggy Seagrave, who, along with her husband Sterling Seagrave, is the author of the remarkably important new book, Gold Warriors, published in hardcover by Verso. The For the Record programs are being archived on Real Audio by WFMU. WFMU.org/Dave Emery is streaming the more recent programs, older programs for download only on a longer URL. Link to both that URL and to the For the Record section of the Spitfire website. The For the Record programs have detailed, annotated descriptions available in the For the Record section within a week of the airing of this broadcast. We will be continuing with our discussion with Peggy Seagrave in Side 2 of this broadcast. This concludes Side 1 of Gold Warriors, an interview with Peggy Seagrave being recorded on October 6th of 2003. For Peggy Seagrave, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening.